Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Tax Talk, broadcast by the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. My name is Jordan Bateman, and I'm the British Columbia Director of the CTF, and joined, as always, by our Alberta Director, Paige MacPherson. Paige, how are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. I'm excited to talk about electoral reform. It's a good topic.
It's like the ultimate nerd political topic, but, we are political nerds, so this will work out well. We're also joined today by our Federal Director, Aaron Wudrick. We're going to talk about electoral reform. Prime Minister Trudeau, of course, promised in the election last year that this would be the last election under first past the post. And he seems to be forging ahead with change. Not sure what kind of change, but we're headed to something. And we want to talk about that, but we also want to talk about how do you ensure that electoral reform is actually endorsed by voters. So we'll talk about all that and more with Aaron, who's freezing his buns off in Ottawa. All right, lots of ways for you to connect with us. If you've joined us here live, you can make sure to subscribe to our feed to keep track of all our shows. You can comment in the sidebar to your right. You can use /Q there, and a question will pop up for us. You can tweet us at Jordan Bateman or at Paige McP or at A Wudrick. Or you can even click call in to ask us a question. Be sure to visit our website at taxpayer.com to see what we're all working on these days. And if you're listening to this later as a podcast or a recording, please feel free to email us. You can get me at bc.director@taxpayer.com. And you can engage on our Facebook page, facebook.com/taxpayer.com. There's the preamble. All right, Paige, what's new?
Well, here in Alberta, a few things are going on. So first of all, one thing that I noticed is that our Premier, Rachel Notley, has gone to Ontario. I think it was in Ontario, and met with Premier Kathleen Wynne. And they're talking about a number of things. I'm sure, as premiers, they've got lots to talk about. But one of the things they're talking about is their energy policy. And it occurs to me that, if you're going to talk to anybody about energy policy, any province in the country, you probably don't want to talk to Ontario to get advice on this. And it's interesting because it was reported, a few months ago when the government here was crafting its energy policy, that the Premier was meeting with Ontario advisors on this. And that's just mind-blowing. When you look at the recent Auditor General report in Ontario, electricity prices are up, 77% at peak times, or 80% almost? It seems like a plan you wouldn't want to emulate unless, and yet it seems that we are completely going down that road, especially when you look at the carbon tax plan and the government's seeming willingness to get into the green energy subsidy business, just like they did in Ontario. So really not good to see that meeting happening.
Yeah, Paige, it strikes me as if you wanted to build a new blimp, you wouldn't consult the people who built the Hindenburg. That's probably not the way to go. And that pretty much sums up what's happening here. It would be charitable to say that the energy market in Ontario is a complete and total disaster. And so looking to Ontario as an example is probably not the best idea for the people of Alberta.
I know. It really blows my mind that of all the provinces, I'm sure there are other provinces where, at the very least, their energy policy hasn't led to headlines that are national about how terrible it is. So, any other premier. But yeah, it's the carbon tax thing. It's an ideological thing, and they're forging ahead with it, and it's really going to suck because the cost of stuff is already up here, and so it's going to be tough. It's one of those things where the government says, oh well, if you don't like the carbon tax, you don't want to pay more, then drive less. Take public transit or they don't usually say this, but I guess the assumption is heat your home less, because those are the two things, gas and home heating, those are the two big ones that are going to be more expensive. It's like, well, we live in Alberta, it gets pretty cold, and also a lot of us don't live in the downtown core, and even in the downtown core of our cities, it's not like downtown Toronto or something with transit. So should be interesting, but I think it's going to be expensive.
Yeah, you're telling me that not a lot of people are taking their bicycles to the oil patch in order to go to work. Is that fair to say?
It's fair to say. I was talking to a friend of mine last night who's a contractor, and he said, so the government wants me to take the bus everywhere. So should I take a whole bunch of 2x4s and this fridge and this toilet all on the bus? Try to get along? It's just not really a feasible thing. I guess the toilet could serve as sort of an extra bus seat. That's really the only silver lining there.
Well, during the Translink referendum out here, one of the yes side companies that was supporting it was a craft brewery downtown. And I don't know what they were thinking, but I guess they thought, oh, we'll make the point that we need clearer roads. So we'll instead, because we don't have clear roads, we're going to deliver one day all of our kegs by SkyTrain. So they had this photo op of these guys with these massive kegs riding a SkyTrain. But it kind of fell flat because, of course, it was illogical. How would a sales tax clear space on roads for these guys to transfer around their thing? And a few people even said, great, if they can take SkyTrain, hey, more power to you. Like you can get it up and down those stairs. So there is no sense of logic when it comes to this kind of thing.
Yeah, no, that's...
Well, it's usually, guys, it comes from people who tend to live in the downtowns of these cities, right? I mean, and that's fine for them. For people where it really is a choice, where you can walk or you can bike, great, do it. A lot of people already do. But the reality is most Canadians, or at least a huge chunk of them, live in places where this stuff's just not practical. And I find a lot of the times people are astonished to realize that, wait a minute, not everybody lives in the downtown of the city like me.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Sorry to interrupt, but I mean, it's also a salary thing. I mean, if you're an MLA making these kind of decisions, you're making a good deal of money, right? You're making over 6 figures. Even if it is more expensive to drive, you can probably still afford it. But for people that, this is going to make a big difference. If I need to heat my home, we're going to have to bulk up on sweaters or whatever. I mean, that can be a big life-changing thing. So that's where, there's just that disconnect. It's frustrating.
Well, there's this sense of groupthink, I think, that has come on the political and the professor class, where they do, like you say, Aaron, they believe everyone lives the way they do. And, why wouldn't they want to live in downtown Vancouver and Cole Harbour in a condo with, why wouldn't everyone want to live like that? They can walk to everything, and everyone should live that way. But that just really is not the reality out. I mean, I live 45 minutes from downtown Vancouver. I live in a completely different way than those eggheads in Cole Harbour who are dictating this policy to people. So this is the kind of thing that, we'll get to electoral reform, and the point of electoral reform is a more representative democracy. I fear that we're not electing people who represent the broader views of Canadians, that we are becoming too centralized on one kind of person. Woody, anything interesting happening in Ottawa? And will you please break out a song, preferably about your struggles against your struggles on Martin Luther King Day, if you don't mind. Break out a song for us now. Sing us a song.
I don't have anything prepared, though, although I certainly do think it was, for those who obviously don't know, the Prime Minister's wife, Sophie Gregoire, decided to belt out a musical number at an event celebrating Martin Luther King Day. Seemed a very odd choice of venue and big to do that. One would think that on a day, designed to celebrate a person of, historical importance, such as Martin Luther King, it would be about him. But unfortunately, all the stories turned out to be about the Prime Minister's wife singing a song, which stuck in the craw of a few people, and understandably so.
Yeah. Do you think it was one of those things where she had this idea, she wanted to use this song in a public forum? Like, we do lots of media. Sometimes you get a line and you're like, oh, I got to use this line somewhere. And you kind of find the interview or the op-ed to fit it into. Do you think it was like that? She wanted to use this song, and this was the moment, and she thought, this is it. I'm gonna break it out.
It might be, but the thing is, they just came into office. She's going to be the first lady of Canadian politics for the next 4 years. You would think she might be able to hold off to find a more appropriate venue or time to do something like that. I mean, it just seemed like a very strange choice of time.
Good singer, though.
Yep.
Good singer.
I haven't heard the clip. I'll take your word for it.
Now, Woody, any thoughts on Davos? I know that's dominating the news this week.
Yeah, look, if some people are sort of making fun of Trudeau for being all chipper and optimistic over there, I don't think that's a problem. I mean, look, every prime minister, part of their job is to go out there and cheerlead and say Canada's great. So I don't see any downside to that. I don't blame the guy. I mean, he's new in office. But what does start to raise eyebrows is, what's the real plan? What are the substantive things you're going to do? And, up till today, a lot of the talk was about, stimulus, which is disconcerting because that usually means spending a lot of money we don't have. And we'll get into all the reasons that's a terrible idea. But today, some more welcome words from him was that he thinks foreign direct investment is a huge priority. And I totally agree. If you look at the size of direct investment in this country. It's massive compared to the $10 billion they're talking about spending. That will stimulate the economy. Foreign direct investment will have a huge impact. So it's good to see the government focusing on that, and I certainly hope going forward they pay more attention to saying, hey, Canada's a good place to do business, rather than scheming up ways that they can spend more taxpayer dollars.
Yeah. I also heard, I don't know if I haven't read all the articles on this, but I saw last night that he met with Leonardo DiCaprio and maybe like Bono and Kevin Spacey. Why were these people at the World Economic Forum? Like, what do they have to do with any of this? I don't understand why celebrities would be invited.
I don't really know how it works, to be honest. I've read some media reports who say there's sort of a caste system in place there where, if you're the super wealthy or you're a world leader, you arrive by helicopter and you're at much better parties and much better functions. And then everything is sort of segregated by your sort of socioeconomic status. It does strike me as a little bit strange, and it's not quite clear what the point of this get-together is sometimes when you see people like celebrities rubbing shoulders with business leaders. I mean, you're absolutely right, Paige. What business does a movie star have at a function where it should be, really heads of state and arguably, some of the wealthiest people who contribute to the economy in the world? It's a very strange beast, this World Economic Forum.
Well, I think for mid-level wealthy people, so like the billionaires, the Bill Gateses, the George Soroses, the Koch brothers, they can get anyone they want to meet with them, right? Maybe for these less famous billionaires, it's good to have these celebrities there because they attract, other key players to come and hang out. I mean, is Justin Trudeau going to whatever party he went to last night if Leo DiCaprio isn't there? Maybe not.
Yeah, good point.
But there you go. All right, I have a couple of media recommendations here. So obviously we're in full swing now in U.S. political season. So my what's new are two things, a TV show and a podcast that I watch and listen to that I think are just fascinating stuff. So I'll do the podcast first. The host of CBS Face the Nation is a guy named John Dickerson. And Dickerson's also on the Slate Political Gabfest. And he's kind of the voice of reason on that Gabfest. There's two uber lefties who are on it. And then John, who just is sort of, middle of the road and at least fair to everyone across the political spectrum. But Dickerson has his own podcast put out by Slate called Whistle Stop. And what Dickerson does is he goes back through the history of U.S. campaigns, and he pulls out little key moments and talks about what led up to that key moment, how it changed electoral politics in the states, and by extension, I mean they're the leader in this, so in the world, and then what the outcome of that, what the outflow of that. And thanks to him, I've learned about crazy elections in the 1880s. I've learned that negative politics didn't just start when the vast right-wing conspiracy took on the Clintons, as were led to believe by MSNBC. So lots of really interesting things there. Very funny, very engaging, and just the kind of political education that I think lots of like if you're downloading a Tax Talk podcast or watching us live, you're gonna love Whistle Stop with John Dickerson. The other one is a new TV show. It's on Showtime in the States. It's on Movie Central here on the Shaw Cable Network. I'm not sure about Rogers or Bell or how you can get it, but it's called The Circus, Inside the Greatest Political Show on Earth. And it's two guys, Mark Halperin and John Heilman. They wrote Game Change and Double Down, which were kind of the definitive histories of the 2008 McCain-Palin first Obama election and the 2012 Romney versus Obama election. These guys are just brilliant reporters. Now they're doing basically an almost up-to-the-moment documentary series on this U.S. campaign. So last week it debuted last Sunday night. They had a show called The Outsiders. It's half an hour long, very slickly produced. Interesting interviews with Bernie Sanders and his wife, a little bit from a Trump rally, and then on the bus with Ted Cruz. But it's a really interesting look into how those campaigns are evolving. This week they'll have a different topic. It's every Sunday night. And the great thing is it's only footage that's 3 or 4 days old tops. So it feels really current, packaged in a very slick way. The two of them are brilliant reporters. Halperin talks about how he has a bus interview with Ted Cruz, and his one goal in these interviews, he says, is to ask a question to ask questions that no one else has asked. And you really kind of see that. You see different sides of these guys and different issues arise. So the circus, it's on the next episode Sunday night. It's the second one. It sounds like they're going to go all the way through the general election. I think this is going to be pretty fascinating stuff.
So cool. It's interesting. So it's been a sad week here in Alberta because Postmedia they do the papers. So like the National Post, they also do things like all the Sun papers now. Did a whole bunch of layoffs here in Alberta across the country, but most of them were here. And it sort of, well, it makes you very sad and whatever. As a former journalist, I'm sad about it for sure and lost some good people. But it also makes you think about sort of the future of journalism, like how this is going to have to change. And those shows sound like, pretty cool examples of that. Just, I don't know. It's interesting. Like, I don't know where it's going to go, but it just reminds me of that. It's a big question mark, I guess.
Do you guys listen to Canadaland? I know, Aaron, you've been on Canadaland Commons.
Yeah, I've listened a few times.
Yeah, it's the Jesse Brown show, and it's kind of media criticism, but he did an interesting thing this week. I mean, he's obviously crowdfunding for his network, and they raise money, so you pledge a monthly amount, and their listeners take care of that. But he released a document this week to his donors that basically laid out all of his metrics. Talked about where the money was going, how much he paid himself, how much he pays freelancers, how much he pays his 2 or 3 staff, future goals. Really interesting exercise in a different kind of media. And, whether it's a documentary like Halpern and Heilman, who obviously are huge names, and, can get a documentary off the ground, or, Jesse Brown, who had ever heard of him before Canadaland, but he's found his niche audience and built this support. Maybe not as, the layoffs were terrible, although one of your Alberta unions say it was just desserts. But,
I know.
I do think there is still hope for newsmaker or for news reporters when they think outside the box, like Jesse has.
I agree.
Well, you've got groups too, like you've got Vice, for example, which seems to be doing fairly well. You've got sort of, independent voices either on the left or right, like you've got Rabble.ca, you've got The Rebel, right? So there are ways out there to make a go of it. I think the fundamental problem that people have to wrap their heads around is there's a lot of free content out there now. And people will not pay for something when they can get it for free. And so when you have a website, and this I think also opens up a Pandora's box for a group like the CBC, for example. The CBC has a lot of eyeballs on its news website, for example. How easy will it be for a newspaper to try and get people to subscribe to get news that people can get for free on CBC's website? So, a lot of hard questions. As Paige says, I think it's always tough when people lose their jobs. I mean, that's never fun for anyone, but who knows where this is going to go? And I do see difficulties ahead for media. They're trying to charge for something that people can get for free elsewhere.
The other thing too is, I don't know how this has worked out for a lot of those independent groups, but it's hard to get accreditation on the Hill or on any legislature to be accredited media to go in and get access to politicians and cover those stories. So we're sort of at this weird purgatory stage, right, where we're sort of transitioning out of traditional news media. Now, I still get 2 newspapers and a magazine delivered to my house, to my doorstep. So, that some people still do, but the numbers are obviously really dwindling. But then you've got these independent groups like The Rebel, for example. I don't think they're accredited media at a lot of, at legislatures in Canada or anything like that. And it's difficult coming from that standpoint to get to be accredited. So there's an issue of access. And that's why we see, I think, a lot of this sort of guerrilla journalism popping up, like almost the bombarding thing of, we see it a lot more in the States, I think, than in Canada, but that's, sort of the next natural transition. If you can't get access the normal way, you got to get access some way. So
grab people on the street, ambush journalism.
Yeah, it's so I was an old newspaper reporter, so like Paige, kind of interested in this stuff. There's a couple of Canuck bloggers, Vancouver Canuck bloggers. They're not affiliated with the Canucks, but they've blogged for years on metrics in hockey, and they've become such experts in it that they're actually hired by certain teams now to come in and consult. And that's a completely different model than we've ever seen before. Yeah. Sometimes I wonder if these big media organizations trying to be everything to everyone. Well, like my wife and I, we love the TV show Survivor. Watched every season, all 31 seasons. The kids watch it. We're Survivor nerds. We support a guy down in the States who does a Survivor podcast. because he's hilarious and we love the, talking about the strategy of the game. So, we flip him, I think it's $3 a month. But we're one of thousands of people who do. And now he's got a full-time job, blogging and podcasting about Survivor of all things. This is something that the CTF we should probably talk about at our Regina meetings is how do we support these independent media outlets that are just getting off the ground? Mm-hmm. And, how do we help foster more of them that, are willing to look into things like government waste, which, obviously is our sweet spot.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a really interesting topic.
Well, we haven't solved the media crisis, but there you go. We'll save that for another episode.
Yeah, maybe next.
Yeah. So let's talk electoral reform, and I guess we should probably break the conversation into two pieces. One, how do you make sure the voters are on board for electoral reform? And second, what could electoral reform actually look like? But maybe we should do the referendum question first, Aaron, just to get that out of the way. The CTF obviously is a group that believes in grassroots. The grassroots having a say. We support recall initiatives in BC, or recall legislation in BC. We support in BC. We also have plebiscite legislation, referendum legislation. We support those kind of direct democracy items. Why wouldn't? It boggles my mind. Why wouldn't we? People demand that they have the right to vote on how we vote in our politicians.
Yeah, it's funny. You're right to separate it into two questions, because part of the problem right now, there's a lot of talk about electoral reform since the October election, but it's been completely taken up by the referendum question. There's been very little debate over the merits of first past the post versus a ranked ballot versus proportional representation. That discussion's not really happening because there's so much focus on, well, when we do try and figure out what we want, how do we decide? Do the Liberals just pass some legislation and it becomes law? Obviously, there are some groups out there that, because they like the idea of reform, they don't want a referendum because they're afraid they might lose it. And I think that that's a terrible reason not to have a referendum. Their argument is the people who want a referendum are just the people who don't want change, so they want a referendum to stop it. And I always point out that very inconveniently for them, the Taxpayers Federation is a perfect example of a group that would like reform. We've supported reform in the past, like we did in British Columbia, but we're not willing to cheat, so to speak, to get there. We're not willing to skip over the will of the people just to get what we want. We're willing to make our case to the people, and we think that's really important. And part of the reason why, some people have said, well, do we put everything to a referendum? Should every law go to a referendum? And I said, it doesn't have to be all or none. But surely something as important as changing how we elect people. I mean, I can't think of anything that is more, that would impact democracy more than changing the nature in which your vote counts, right? I mean, short of, sort of being constitutional. I mean, the Constitution requires certain things. There's an amending formula and the provinces have to be on board. This is about as close to constitutional as you can get, if it isn't in fact constitutional. So, and then there's another issue here, which is, the Liberals in their platform, they made a very vague promise. Very, very vague. All they said was, well, this will be the last election before past the post. They did not at all specify, what they replace it with. If they had, I still think we'd need a referendum, but they'd have a lot stronger case. They'd be in a lot firmer footing saying, look, we were really clear. We said we would do X, so we're going to do it. We have a mandate. And so the fact that they didn't do that, and that there are certain people who advocate for certain types of electoral reform, but not others, are saying, well, this means clearly my type of reform has to be pushed through. One group doing this is Fair Vote Canada, is talking a lot about proportional representation and talking as if it's a foregone conclusion that the change is going to be proportional representation. And I'm stopping saying, hold on a second. There are a lot of people that like some kinds of reform, but not other kinds. You can't just roll up all kinds of reform and add those numbers together and say, well, 62% of people want reform. Well, that's not entirely true, right? Some people like this, but not that. Some people like the status quo more than this, but less than that. And so the easiest way is to just ask people. Let's just ask them. I do not fear the public. I certainly don't buy the argument that people are too stupid or unable to understand. The opponents of a referendum say, well, it's too complicated an issue, that people can't grasp it. So first of all, I think that's nonsense. But even if it were true, then why do we trust them when it comes to voting? How can it be too complicated for them in the context of a referendum, but very simple and understandable in the context of a general election? I just don't understand how they can make that.
Well, especially when you consider the platforms that you see in, election campaigns. They're pages and pages and pages and pages and pages. Most people don't read those whole platforms. They still make a good informed choice. We've got an informed and intelligent electorate. This is so basic compared to that. This is the fundamental question. Like, I really think that we should have this referendum on it. But in terms of understanding it, you're only talking about this one policy. So I agree. I mean, that argument about, people they don't fully understand it, so they'll always say no. Like, it just really falls flat and gets back to that, like, that voters are stupid argument that's just so frustrating, right, for people who are pushing policy goals that then other people are going to have to live with and pay for.
Yeah, it's just cherry picking too, right? I mean, some of the proponents of reform without a referendum have said, well, the vast majority of Canadians, 60-something%, voted for parties that proposed electoral reform. So therefore, we should change it. And I'm saying, well, by the same measure, the majority of Canadians voted for parties that promised a balanced budget. Are those people going to say, therefore, the Liberals are obligated to do that? They're not making that argument. And then back to the vagueness thing again. Can anyone imagine a party running on a promise? If elected, I promise this will be we will change the status quo on taxes, without telling you what that means. Does that mean you can abolish taxes? Does that mean you can raise taxes to 90%? I don't think anybody would buy that as legitimate, and yet they seem to think it's okay when it comes to electoral reform, that you've been supremely vague, and that means, well, whatever you decide, we're going to have to be okay with it. It just doesn't.
And once we get into the nitty gritty of electoral reform, I mean, there's big differences, right? So you can say, yeah, this many people actually voted for some kind of electoral reform, but do we stick with a majoritarian system similar to what we have now? We radically shift to something proportional. I mean, it's there's so much like wiggle room within there that, I mean, that's just silly too.
Aaron, what do you think of this emerging argument and from some of these, don't let us vote before we change the system people, that we should have 2 elections under a new system and then let people vote about whether or not they want to go back to first past votes? Isn't that really playing into, our argument that, yeah, people deserve a say? And isn't it just a cynical thing that people are too dumb to really understand electoral reform? If we expect them to vote in real elections that have been reformed under a different system, why wouldn't we think that they would, be able to figure that out before they vote?
Yeah, it's interesting. I thought it was that's actually a clever mechanism, because I think what they're trying to get at is they're trying to get away from this, what they're calling a status quo bias, right? They argue that most people, when presented with a choice, if they're not sure about the alternative, they're going to stick with the status quo. So they're saying, well, let's give them a taste. And then, it's like if you have to do a taste test between 2 drinks, you got to sip them both, and then you can tell us which one you want. So I understand what they're getting at, but I would argue a couple of things. One is they're just going to switch the bias. They're just, if people are more comfortable with whatever they have had yesterday, then you replaced one bias for another, so you haven't fixed anything. And then the other is, they're saying, well, let's have a referendum to keep it. Well, why not just make it a sunset clause instead? Would they be okay with that? Saying, okay, we're going to have one referendum or 2 elections under this system, but it will automatically revert to the old system unless people, vote to keep this one. Would they be okay with that? Because if they're really just trying to set themselves up for an easier win, I think that's them trying to rig the game. And look, I also throw out the argument that having a referendum means you're going to kill reform. It's nonsense. You look at New Zealand, they had a referendum, they won overwhelmingly. So, really it's up to groups, and we may be one of those groups, depending on what reform is. You have to persuade people. You can't take a shortcut. If you believe in your case and the merits of your case are strong, sell it to the people. You should not fear a referendum.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So, Aaron, let's switch gears then and talk about electoral reform in general. British Columbia attempted to reform the political system. Gordon Campbell, after his landslide majority in 2001, where he got about 50% of the vote, but got 77 of the 79 seats. He recognized that there was an appetite for electoral reform. He formed a citizens' assembly that came up with a single transferable vote. It went to referendum. First time, 58% of British Columbians said, yeah, we should change the system. However, the threshold to change was 60%. Second time that referendum was held 4 years later, less than 50% supported it. So, we have a bit of a template here in BC as to how to, get to a new electoral system. But, if, let's say, Prime Minister Trudeau has fallen and bumped his head and he's decided Aaron Wudrick is going to be the leader of our hypothetical electoral reform committee, what would you do to what system would you put in place? What would you do to make sure that whatever reform comes through is supported by the people?
Aside from calling a referendum, look, I think this needs to be a process where the people are involved. I think BC actually provides an excellent template. We can't leave this solely in the hands of politicians. It's simply too big a matter. So striking something like a citizens' assembly, they did that in Ontario as well, of course, after they did in BC. I think this is a good precedent. I think it allows regular people from all walks of life to talk about these issues and hash out the ideas that are out there. People are familiar with some of the most common options, but who knows, there might be some other systems out there we haven't stumbled upon yet or other ideas. So I think that's worth the exercise. And, I think, whether or not we do change from the status quo, there's clearly enough disgruntlement that we need to have this conversation. And so, to be clear, we think reform is important. In terms of, the process, I don't have a problem with the parliamentary committee, as I said, as long as there is a citizens' assembly as well, some other form of input, and capped off by a referendum. So this is not a slapdash. It's not something you can rush through in 6 months. I know the Liberals promised, to have law in place within 18 months. I think that's unrealistic. I think they need to slow this down because, it is something that has an impact far broader than any other policy, right? Any other piece of policy a government passes, whether you like it or not, you can pass judgment in the next election on the government for passing it. This is different. This would actually change the mechanism you use to hold people accountable. So I think that means it's not something you can take a shortcut on.
Yeah, and when it comes to, government consultations, there's a friend of mine here that I work with sometimes. She calls them dog and pony shows. Like a lot of times, they bring in their pals, people who they know are going to give them the feedback. There's maybe the token person who's going to oppose it, overwhelmed by, 39 of 40 other people that, are giving this opinion. I'm referencing, of course, when I was at the climate change carbon tax consultations here in Alberta, because I felt like the token, the one out of 40 that was opposing. But they often are like that, right? That's what they pan out to be. So it's not, when government said, we're going to do thorough consultation, we're going to talk to the people about this. A lot of times it's just for show, right? They know the objective that they want to get to. They're going to get there either way. The only thing that really can guarantee that the people actually have their say is a referendum. It's so basic. If we believe in democracy, if this is about enhancing democracy, the concept of having it with any other means other than a vote is just ridiculous.
Well, they tried to frame it as, well, we'll have an all-party committee, to look into this. Well, guess what? Every committee is all-party. The problem is one party, the government, has a majority on the committee, so they get to decide. So it doesn't really matter. You can frame it in whatever non-partisan language you want. The reality is the government controls the committee, so they will get the outcome they want. That is why this can't be left solely in the hands of the committee.
What about this? So obviously the government, the Liberals during the campaign were very critical about the Harper administration being, I don't know, what some people would say dictatorial or just sort of being very top down, not allowing for choice, not allowing a lot of dissent. Isn't this kind of the same thing? If you're not going to allow choice on this very, very fundamental matter, are they getting any criticism from that angle?
They have got some. I think they certainly deserve more. Look, they and the other opposition parties were very critical, for example, of the changes that the Conservatives brought in to what they call the Fair Elections Act, which were some changes to things like, could overseas Canadians vote, ID requirements for voting, arguably serious, but certainly nothing of the scale of what the Liberals were proposing in electoral reform. Back then, they argued it was undemocratic to ram these things through, and yet now suddenly they feel comfortable, talking about electoral reform without a referendum, having not specified it in their own platform. I find that a little bit rich.
What's the NDP saying on this? What's their position?
Well, I think that the NDP are one of the ones Jordan was referring to that have proposed. I know Nathan Cullen has proposed this. Let's change the system and have to, do it twice and then have a referendum. So I think they're kind of hedging their bets. But I think much like some other advocates who prefer a certain kind of reform, I think they're going to find themselves in an awkward position if the type of reform the Liberals propose is not one they like, because they're going to spend all this time saying we don't need a referendum. And then if the Liberals roll out a reform they don't like, their hands are going to be tied because they spend all this time saying, well, whatever they do is okay, they have a mandate. Well, then you won't be able to criticize anything either. So I think it's a silly strategy on their part.
Aaron, do you have a preference on the system? Like, do you have a preference on single transferable vote or proportional representation or even first past the post? Or maybe not a preference, but why don't you just give us kind of the strengths and weaknesses of each, maybe? And I mean, those seem to be the three main ones on the menu.
Yeah, those are the sort of three choices. So, I think the first thing everyone has to acknowledge is that there's no objective way to measure which is better, right? It really comes down to what is important to you, what do you think are the most important features that a system should have, right? There's never going to be agreement on that. That doesn't mean we can't change it if enough of us feel strongly about some features more than others. So start with our status quo, first past the post, right? Defenders of the system argue it's served us relatively well. Right, Canada has been relatively well governed compared to other countries since its inception, so that's one thing to recommend it. It's also very simple. People understand you go in, you check off the one you want, whoever gets the most wins. It's pretty straightforward. And it does also, the way the system is set up now, there's a link between you and your representative. So there's a geographic link, like you choose someone from your community to go represent you, in Ottawa, in the provincial capital. They speak for your community, they live in your community, so there's an understanding about what the needs are in that community. So that's the sort of pro for the first past the post. The con is that sometimes, as the example you gave in British Columbia, but in most elections, it can lead to a very odd result in terms of, a party gets 1 million votes, but they don't elect any MPs because the votes are spread out in such a way, whereas another party can get a fraction of those votes, but elect a whole bunch of MPs. So, in other words, yeah, exactly. So your vote actually counts very differently based on where you live, and there's something fundamentally troubling about that. So that, I think, is one of the biggest defects of that system. The other end of the spectrum is what they call proportional representation, and it's a pretty straightforward idea in theory. If you get 10% of the votes, then you get 10% of the seats, in the legislature. That's very appealing to a lot of people because it seems fair in the sense that, if 10% of the people want something, then they get 10% of the say. The problem is a couple of things. One is that if you can imagine a situation where, say, two parties have 48% of support and one party has 4%, that party with the 4% that gets the 4 out of 100 seats, they have a lot more power than 4%. They're actually driving the bus. And so you don't end up with a situation where the actual control or the influence is proportionate. It's just the number of people, but how the influence plays out depends on how the pie is divided up. The other thing too is it puts a lot of power into the hands of a political party, because in a PR system, there's basically a party publishes a list saying, if we get 1%, then we're going to have, person A is the MP, and if we get 2%, person B. So the party controls a lot of power in terms of who the elected person is going to be. And there's also no guarantee that person will be from your community. You might end up, if you voted for the Purple Party, you might end up with a representative who lives on the other end of the country from you. They don't know anything about where you're from, and they have no way of speaking to yours. And you frankly have no one to call. If you have a local concern, who do you call? You may not have anyone representing your area. So that's the other end of the spectrum. In the middle, we've got a system, and this is the system that was proposed in British Columbia and is in place in a lot of other countries. It's called the single transferable vote, or the ranked ballot. And all it means is when you go in, you just rank your choices. This is my first choice 1, party B, second choice 3, and they count the votes until somebody gets 50%. So if your number one choice is a party that doesn't get enough of the votes, they throw out your first choice and then count your second choice until somebody gets 50%. This seems to be, for lack of a better way of putting it, the system everyone, if you're open to reform at all, this is the system everyone can agree with. It sort of shaves off some of the more distortionary parts of first past the post, but retains the sort of single local representative and tries to sort of address the imbalance. So that is the system that CTF supported, for example, in the referendum. And I think a lot of people are arguing that is the system that the new government is going to go towards. Of course, the criticism being that the Liberals, being known as a party that's in the middle of the spectrum, that people are saying it's going to be self-serving because, the Liberals are everyone's second choice if they're not their first choice. So, they're going to guarantee themselves a lot of support in the future.
Now, is there any nuanced differences between, could single transferable vote be designed in such a way that it isn't exactly ranked ballot? This might be a too new question. Yeah. But yeah, so I mean, in BC, it wasn't presented as that simply, was it? As just sort of ranked ballot? Wasn't it a little bit more complicated? And that was part of the problem, perhaps, in when it was being proposed.
Yeah, you're right. Look, and this is one of the arguments that more people make. This is very complicated. You don't want to bother people with the details. The details do matter, but I think things like single transferable voter rank ballot, it's pretty intuitive. I mean, it's no different than saying, give me, rank a list of your 3 favorite colors. I mean, you understand what it means to have a first choice and a second choice and a third choice. So I don't know if I'm concerned about that, but I just simply meant to say that it's a system that retains some of the familiar features of what we have right now. So it wouldn't be something, I think proportional representation would be a dramatic departure from what we have right now. And I think a lot of people, whether they like it or not, it would be something they would have to wrap their heads around, whereas the ranking of the votes might change the way you have to, when you go behind the screen and mark your ballot, but it's not something that would really make you scratch your head in terms of, well, I'm not sure how this result turned out.
Right.
Yeah. What's the timeline for this, Aaron? Liberals given any indication about it, and who's kind of the lead in cabinet on this?
Yeah, as I said, in their platform, they said they'd have legislation within 18 months. So that's their stated timeline. They've made signals saying that they don't intend to have a referendum. I take that to be very carefully chosen language, which means they might try and get away with it if they think they can, but they have not firmly closed the door to having one. I think it's important for groups, from across the political spectrum, to make the case that, whether you like reform or not, it's important Canadians have say on this. So, and CTF is certainly going to be one of those voices. And the lead minister is a lady by the name of Mary Monsef. She's a new MP, a new cabinet minister, obviously with the new government. But it seems like an earnest woman. Seems willing to listen. Obviously, like a lot of folks in this new government, very new, and so has to learn the ropes a little bit. But she claims to be open to listening, and so will certainly be one of the people hoping to persuade her of the wisdom of having a referendum.
Sounds good. Well, thanks for all your work on the file, Aaron. I know this is something that's going to consume a lot of your hours from here.
Oh, it's okay. I have nothing else to do here in Ottawa. Yeah. Very light load.
Yeah, so one might point out to the Liberals that if they are going to violate their $10 billion deficit cap, why not violate the 18-month provision in the referendum promise?
One promise, whatever.
Yeah, for sure. All right, well, now it's time for our Waste of the Week, an example of how government is wasting your hard-earned tax dollars. So Bill McQuarrie over at newskamloops.com, talking about a new media outlet that's opened up and is supported by their readers, had a very interesting column on spending in British Columbia. Now, it's so good, I'm going to read you a brief excerpt of it. Here's the question. What organization has 8 CEOs, 27 vice presidents, 53 board directors, and gets over $10 million of your provincial tax money each and every year? The answer are 5 regional health authorities, including the Interior Health Authority. And you can be forgiven if you're already asking, did he say 8 CEOs for 5 health authorities? Good question. But we have no idea why we need 8 CEOs to run those 5 authorities. Mind you, he also doesn't know why we need 53 directors or 27 vice presidents either. But here's the bottom line. Every single year, we've seen a medical services premium tax increase in BC, the only kind of this healthcare tax in all of Canada. It goes up by 2 or 3 times the rate of inflation every single year for the past decade. It's more than doubled in that time. And it just warms my heart to think that my $150 a month goes to support those poor 8 CEOs, 27 vice presidents, and 53 board directors of all those health authorities. That's our Waste of the Week. Well, that's it for this episode of Tax Talk from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Be sure to follow Paige on Twitter at Paige McP. Follow Aaron at A. Wudrick, or follow me at Jordan Bateman. If you're watching this on Blab, be sure to subscribe to our feed. And give us some props. And if you're listening to this on iTunes, please subscribe and give us a good rating. We're number 24, the number 24 rated podcast in the government and organizations section. Look out, PETA. We're coming for you at number 23. You can check out our website at taxpayer.com. And be sure to join us next week, Friday, January 29th, 9 a.m. Pacific, noon Eastern. Paige is away on assignment. I don't know if that's true, but on assignment.
Makes it sound really important.
So I'll be minding the store. Keep an eye on taxpayer.com/tax talk for information on guests and who I rustle up to come and join me for that. Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks.
Cheers.